So, lecture today, ideals and denials. How many of you were in History 151, that's U.S. History 2, 1865, at some point? 4 or 5 of you. What I'm going to say right now is probably disappointing to you because I'm going to encapsulate all of History 151 in the next 35 or 40 minutes. It is an attempt to bring those of you who have not had the benefit of that class up to speed on what's really important in American history to 1865. This class starts in 1865. Why is 1865 such a big deal? This is where I like to say, be bold.
I'm not 100% sure, but I think, isn't it when the Civil War ended?
There you go. It's when the Civil War ended. One of the most, if not the most important war in American history, the Civil War, ends in 1865. And to this day, almost all history courses stop at the end of the Civil War. At some point, we're going to have to change that because history just keeps on marching, right? So, lecture ideals. What are the ideals that have formulated the American history? What are the ideals, philosophies, ideas that Americans have valued over the time that they attempted to build their nation on? Thank you. Freedom and equality. And I developed that in the syllabus. So when you read the syllabus later on today, you're going to see that I'm consistent. May not be all that bright, but at least I'm consistent. And so this is about the development of the ideals of freedom and equality up till 1865. And then denials. Human beings are not perfect. None of us, no, not one. How do I know that? Bible tells me. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. All have sinned, imperfect, right? Everything about us is fallen, is inadequate in some way. Our ability to reason is not what it was intended to be. We're fallen because of sin. So we don't even achieve our own goals in terms of perfection, right? Our own ideals. We fall short. We deny those in some way. How could we expect that a nation then could be perfect? We can't. It's not going to be. It may be so imperfect that we have to turn our backs on it and say we don't want to be those people. Most of us would agree that Nazi Germany would fit that category. Okay? But then we also have to be realistic. What's possible? Perhaps there's something about us that we value, we don't want to lose. We don't want to turn our backs on that. Something to be admired, even though we have failed along the way. Denials, you see. So what are our ideals and how did we fail to live up to them? The American story. American history is primarily a story of two competing and yet also complementary ideals. Freedom and equality. Most people haven't thought about freedom and equality too much. They take them for granted, but freedom and equality are competing ideals. In America, I am not free to smack you in the face. I get arrested for that. My freedom then is restricted. Restricted by the concept of equality. I have to treat you as an equal, or should. See? You have rights as well. One of those rights is that I cannot hit you in the face. Not without being punished anyway. Freedom and equality. If I take away someone else's freedom, I am denying them equality, am I not? Okay. If someone else is more free than I am, we're not equal. The English Puritans who came to America in the early 1600s had very different notions compared to most human beings at their time, compared to other Europeans and certainly compared to other Englishmen as to how life should be lived. They are strange people, folks, these Puritans. They wanted to be free to worship God, there's that word, free, as they pleased. And they also had the idea that the church should be separate from the state. That was not the way Europeans lived in general, certainly not in England. Church and state are one. The king, the English king, is head of the state and he's head of the church, the Anglican church. The idea of separation of church and state was new. Yes, and if you're confused, yes, it's these religious people who are saying separation of church and state. They don't want the state, that is the state church, to tell them how to worship. They want to be free to worship God as they pleased. They also had the idea that civil law should be separate from church law, separation of church and state again. Okay? Now, most of you are familiar enough with American history to realize that we have separation of church and state here. Well, where does that idea come from? Most people would have said it was an Enlightenment idea, coming from the secular side of philosophy. No, no, and no! It's a Christian idea. Now, secular philosophy will reinforce it. Okay? They also believed in religious freedom for themselves. Key phrase, for themselves. They did not believe that Christians who disagreed with them should be free to live with them in their new communities in the new world. They did not want other Christians who had different ideas about how to worship and so forth, different theological ideas, to live amongst them because they wanted to create their own community where everybody was on the same page. Okay? Living the same way. In their minds, those other Christians or anybody else could go somewhere else in the wilderness and start their own community. There was a lot of space. Now, for me, that seems entirely rational. You don't like the way we live? Why do you want to live with us? Right? Go somewhere else. So that's what they thought. The Puritans were all about creating a new kind of community. Community for the Puritans is huge. One which devoted itself to God and each other in a common fellowship. Common fellowship. Dissenters, those who disagreed with them, would ruin their idea of community. So again, they can go somewhere else. The Puritans also believed that God had particularly called them to create this new community. They have a mission, a destiny from God. A destiny, a call from God to go do something special in the world. If you have a destiny, you have to fulfill it. You can only have a destiny if there is a God. Their community was, as they put it, a city on a hill. A city on a hill. A community they hoped that would be created, and it's just a tiny little community to start with, a few hundred people, that would shine a light to the rest of the world on how God wanted people, human beings, to live. A city on a hill. From Matthew 5:14, almost everything the Puritans did was related to Scripture in some way, where Jesus says to his followers, "You are the light of the world." A city on a hill cannot be hidden. So the Puritans wanted to create this city on a hill and shine a light for the rest of the world to see how they believed God wanted human beings to live in this village of community. Okay? And they naively believed that if the rest of the world could see them do this, the rest of the world would go, "Oh, wow, that's great. Let's do that." What's wrong with that idea? That's not the way human beings think. Okay? Well, you got your way and we got ours. But nevertheless, they were trying to create the city on a hill that would shine a light on what they thought God wanted people to be and do. So these are radical ideas for their day. And remember, we have to compare these people to their day, not to people 400 years in the future. Stop and think about what that would mean for you. Let's imagine what people 400 years from now will say about you as they apply their values to you. How do you think you'll come off? I shudder to think. I don't know what they're going to think or what they're going to value, what they will have gone through in those 400 years to shape their ideas. I would hope that they would look back on me and with some sense of compassion and human understanding and empathy, right? Yeah. They will only be able to do that, though, if they have some sense of history. See? If they don't, if they're cut off from the past, then they'll just look at us and go, wow, how horrible were those people? Let's compare people then to their day, to other people in their day. See, that's a more fair comparison. And let's try to compare them using values that transcend not 1 century, not 3 centuries, but millennia. Okay? And again, let's try to have some compassion. So radical ideas of freedom, destiny, equality. But as advanced as they were for their day, and they are advanced for their day, the Puritans did not try to create a perfectly egalitarian, there's a great word, a perfectly egalitarian society. No, no, no. Egalitarian is just a scholarly way of saying equality. Not a society that's perfectly equal, egalitarian. When you go home for a break, you can throw that word out at the dinner table and impress the parents. Puritan society was still divided by class, not perfectly equal. Some white men were seen as upper class, and some white men were seen as lower class. Same with women, depending on who you were married to or who your father was. Indians are not equal with whites, not in this society. And there were indentured servants, white people who were actually servants who could not leave that servitude because they owed money. See, indentured servants. And later, there are going to be slaves, even in the North. Still, it is essential to remember that this Puritan society was a huge step towards freedom and equality compared to the rest of the world, compared to Europe. In Europe, monarchy was still the norm. What's a monarchy? Who's the head of a monarchical form of government? A king. And the king rules with the aid of his elites, his nobles, of the dukes and the counts and the barons and so forth. And in some cases, the leaders of the church. And these people are the top 10% at most of a nation. And the rest are commoners. They're vastly inferior. There's no notion of equality, quite the opposite. The essential story of American history and the theme of this class is how, beginning with the Puritan forefathers and mothers, the American people gradually became what? More egalitarian and more free. Gradually. Doesn't happen overnight. Sometimes it happens with lurches, though, oftentimes as the result of a war. Massive change. In other words, it's the story of the progress of equality, the progress of freedom. And that's why this history should matter to you. You are among the most free and equal and prosperous people that the world has ever known. And it is an immense blessing to be born an American. at the turn of the last millennium. And you should not take that for granted. It could be lost. The Enlightenment. So we've already seen how Puritan Christianity contributed to the ideas of liberty and equality. In the 18th century, Enlightenment ideas were added to these Christian ideas to help create the way the American people thought, to what I call the American mind. It's not just Christian. It's not just secular either, though. In our country today, if you were at the vast majority of our secular universities, you would hear about what I'm going to tell you in just a moment about the Enlightenment and its impact on the American people, especially in the era of the American Revolution, and how it was Enlightenment values that made the American Revolution and then brought forth this new country. True, not the whole story. What's usually left out is the part of the story I've told you already about the Puritans and Christianity and their contribution to the American mind. It's a complicated story. But because modern secular historians don't care much about Christianity, they tend to slight that story. But this part is important as well. If you were in a Christian history class, perhaps in high school or whatever, and they didn't tell you about the Enlightenment, then you didn't get the whole story either. This is crucial. The Enlightenment was a secular, that is, non-religious, European philosophical movement that advanced the ideas of what? Freedom and equality, in a way that had not been done until this time. And so the Enlightenment is crucial for our story. All of our founding fathers understood the Enlightenment and were persuaded to some degree by Enlightenment values. But they did this from a rational approach. They reasoned towards the Enlightenment using just their minds. How's that different from Christianity? Christians don't use their minds. Thanks for laughing, those of you who did. Of course they do. It's not what I mean. What is the source of truth for Christians? Thank you. In other words, revelation. God has revealed His truth to us through His written word, the Bible. Okay? We read the Bible, that's true. We reason from that point on. Enlightenment philosophy does not start with the Bible. It starts with man's mind and the world. And so you reason towards truth based on observation of the real world. That's very different. What is that the precursor of? Thank you. Yeah, the scientific method, right? Where you conduct an experience, it blows up in your face, don't do that again. Or it creates the outcome you were looking for, you write down what you did in order to achieve that, you have truth, right? Okay. So Enlightenment philosophy is the birth of the modern scientific movement. Well, Enlightenment philosophers didn't just reason about science, they also reasoned about government and human life. They thought they could find out the discover truth about government by observation, which is why this is important to us in terms of the American mind. John Locke, amongst many others, Isaac Newton, argued that men, using their own reason or rational thinking, could find truth. And for Locke, he wasn't primarily concerned about scientific truth, he was concerned about truth in terms of philosophy and government. He argued that kings, which was the normal form of government at that time, had no God-given right to rule. That government should be a contract between men, designed to serve men. Men were not intended to serve kings. Locke, again, argued that government should be a contract between men that would help both men, both groups, equally. And that men had no obligation to serve kings. Just to give you a brief and very rudimentary example of Locke's reasoning, he thought about what it must have been like eons ago when men first began to meet one another right in the wild. Families lived with families, and maybe they had tribes and such, but very small groups of people met. And perhaps one group of human beings would meet, and then there would be another group of human beings, and they could go to war, right? There could be a small battle for who controlled that little valley. And oftentimes that's probably what happened. But it might be that a couple of wise people in these two small groups would meet together and say, hey, let's have an agreement, a contract, right? Although they didn't call it contract. You guard the north end of the valley. We'll guard the south end of the valley. We'll share the fertile areas along the stream here, and we will both prosper. There's a contract there, folks. This is how civilizations arise. This is what Locke argued. In the beginning, men were free and equal. They made contracts. This is natural philosophy. Government should be a contract where men are treated equally. Okay? John Locke. You can see how that would come down and impact our founding fathers. Government's a contract between equals. We're not built to serve kings, you see. So the Enlightenment added a powerful twin engine in America to the ideas of equality and liberty that had begun with Puritan thought. By the eve of the American Revolution in the 1760s and 1770s, most Americans now had adopted, they had engrafted these ideas of the Enlightenment onto their already there Christian base. So what are the two sources of the American mind at this point? Enlightenment thought, Puritan Christianity. Now that is a test question. See, that matters. Also, what is Enlightenment thought? Okay, who is one of the great Enlightenment philosophers? John Locke. What did he think? See, that's the kind of question I'm going to ask you. Those are questions that matter. Those are questions that inform your understanding of the world today. See, if I ask you, well, when did the 7 Years' War end? It's not going to help you one iota. See? That's not history. So now we're to the American Revolution. After the 7 Years' War ended in 1763, don't write that down, Great Britain now, and you probably all know this, began to tax her colonies. Great Britain had won the war, defeated France. The English colonists, they're British, they had helped Great Britain defeat France. No surprise there. But the war, as most wars are, was enormously expensive. And now the British are in debt. It had been a world war, frankly. And so the British are saying now for the first time, hey, we need to tax those colonists. Up till this point, the colonists had not paid anything towards the British treasury. And so now Great Britain just decides, hey, we're going to tax the colonists. And so if your understanding of the American Revolution is that it's basically a tax revolt, there's truth there. These are new taxes that had never been done before. There was 150 years of history in the colonies in which the colonists had not been taxed by Great Britain, and now Great Britain proposes to do that, and guess who's mad? Well, in case you're confused, go home and ask your parents if they want higher taxes. Probably not. But here's the key point. It's not just higher taxes. Great Britain is not going to ask the colonists to vote on new taxes, folks. They're just going to put them on. No voting. And so then the cry arises in the colonies over the next few years. What? No taxation without representation, which means we need to be able to vote on this. You're not treating us as equals. You're not treating us as free men. You see? Freedom and equality. Great Britain looks down on these colonists as lesser human beings that don't deserve the right to vote or a say in their own government. Now, after time, this takes years, the colonists come to believe that Great Britain, the king, George III, has broken faith with them. Can't be trusted. And so the American Revolution is an effort to reestablish a more egalitarian and free society. The American colonists are not looking forward as much as they're looking backward to before the 7 Years' War, the way things were. We want that again. But because wars oftentimes do this, the pendulum swings dramatically forward. And so now they end up striving for more than what they had. The results of the war. That's what you need to do. You need to know the cause of this war. You need to know the results of this war because they're so dramatic, you see. And they impact you. So the American Revolution is an effort to reestablish freedom and equality in America, or at least more. In addition, under the influence of Puritan, Christian, and Enlightenment ideas, the Americans now, in the middle of this war and then shortly afterwards, decide not to create a monarchy of their own. Some Americans thought, well, we need a king. Even Americans who were in the revolution on the side of the Patriots, some of them thought, well, we need to get our own king here, King George I of America. Right? Fortunately, they had a guy named George who fit the bill. But most Americans thought, no, that's a mistake. We don't want to do that. Let's learn from our own past. Let's do something new. Let's do what Locke said. Let's do what the Christians said about separation of church and state. No monarchy. Let's establish a republic, a nation of laws in which people are more equal and more free. Note, I did not say perfectly equal and perfectly free. They are not. That can't happen because we're not perfect people. But more, yes. Better, yes. And power is going to reside in this new republic, not in a monarch, not in a king, but in the people themselves. What does your Constitution say? What is the first words? We the people. In order to form a more perfect union. We did this. We the people. Not the king. This is a major step in the development of the twin ideas of freedom and equality. Nevertheless, even the Americans at this time did not fully appreciate the meanings of the words they wrote. Not perfect. Denials, right? There were still serious inequities, inequalities in the United States. Most men, most white men could vote, okay? Most could. But not all, because in most states there were property qualifications. They're not high, but you had to own some property to vote. Most men could vote. But there were still classes amongst men. Some were upper class, some were lower class. Women could not vote. Women were not seen as the equals of men and will not be, depending on who you talk to this day. Yeah. Now, does that mean that life has not changed at all from the time of the Revolution for women? No. gradually becoming more equal and more free, right? And I don't even know how you would gauge this, whether women are equal and totally free today. How would you determine that? I don't know. But most of the statistics in business and so forth tell us that women aren't quite there yet in terms of income and such. See? So we're not even there yet. And these are women who are loved by their husbands most of the time. Really? I don't even want to go there. There's a scripture in the Bible that says, as a paraphrase, some things are too hard for me. Yeah, some things are too hard for me. Well, Indians were not citizens. Indians can't vote. They're not equals in any way. And they're oftentimes treated with contempt. But worst of all, of course, were the African slaves. They have no freedom or equality whatsoever. So here is this enormous progress in terms of white male equality and freedom. Don't forget that. We got to compare them to the rest of the world, okay? And yet there are also enormous denials, failures. And here's the truth. If you can grasp this, it'll help you so immensely. Human nature is to simplify, to move all the way one way or all the way the other. And so today, America's great. And if you criticize America at any time, you're not quite on the bandwagon of America's great, okay? Or America's a failure. America has been a racist society its entire time. That's all that matters. You see? All the way one way, all the way the other. The truth is in the middle. It's more complicated. You can take that and apply that to almost every aspect of life. When you're a leader in your own business or in some huge company, you're going to find people sitting at the table and they're going to want to simplify all the way one way or all the way the other. And both those extremes are going to be wrong. See? And just to throw you a curveball, once in a very great while, there's something that's right in the extreme. And there's something that's right in the other extreme. See? But not the whole position usually. Life is really complicated. A down-to-earth example. I love her. She's perfect. There's nothing wrong with her. Day after you're married. I should have seen that. And if your whole world is set up with the idea that she has to be perfect, you're out of here. You're out of here. Not going to work. You better be more realistic. And ladies, twice as much so. You see? Complicated. Most important aspect of American history, then, is the gradual development of freedom and equality here. Don't forget that word gradual. The revolution in the Constitution had been about getting greater freedom and equality for white men. The rest of American history is largely about adding other groups of people to this freedom and equality. The Civil War. We got to get up to 1865, don't we? As the early 19th century passed into the mid-19th century, many people in the northern part of the United States became opposed to slavery on biblical grounds. They saw slavery as immoral. In response, Southerners also appealed to the Bible to support slavery. Yes, they did. This is a very religious Christian culture. people naturally appeal then to the Bible for whatever position they hold. And the Bible is such a vast and complicated book that people can oftentimes find something to support their position in the Bible. There are many passages in the Bible which recognize that slavery existed in the ancient world. Southerners then poorly reason that because the Bible mentions slavery in the ancient world, that slavery must be okay. Well, the Bible mentions a lot of things in the ancient world, and we don't argue that they're okay. Murder, for example. Yeah. Northerners argued that slavery was contrary to the basic principles of Jesus Christ, and it is. Love your neighbor as yourself. Not many of us are willing to enslave ourselves, right? Meanwhile, slavery became crucial to the survival of the Southern agricultural economy. Southerners believed they could not give up their slaves and remain prosperous on their farms and plantations. Who's going to do the work? The hard work. So the stage now in the middle of the 19th century is set for a conflict between the anti-slavery North and the pro-slavery South. And by the way, just as an aside, if you were in a high school class and the teacher argued that the Civil War was not about slavery, that's crap. Anybody in a class like that? Not about slavery? Yeah, it's still out there. We're doing everything we can to eradicate that, but it's still out there. But when I was in high school, that was very popular. That was the norm. But see, history has changed. No, not the past, but the interpretation of the past has changed. And what has happened in the last 40 years is that historians have gone back to the original interpretation of the Civil War. The interpretation of the Civil War that the people who fought it understood. Somehow we lost that interpretation in the intervening centuries because it became too complex for us, okay? Too difficult. Had to have something easier. Well, we're back now. The modern interpretation of the Civil War is that it is a conflict over slavery. And that's with the secular historians and with the Christian historians. There's no difference there. Praise the Lord. So the stage is set then for this conflict that's going to tear the country apart. In the 1850s, and of course the war begins in 1861 and it ends in 1865. You have 4 years of war in the early 1860s. In the 1850s, the modern Republican Party, the Republican Party of today, was born. This is when it comes into existence. It comes into existence for one reason. In the North, there was a need for a clearly anti-slavery party. And the whole idea at the time, and this is where it gets complicated, was to stop the extension of slavery into the Western territories. In case you're not sure about what those territories are, that's the territories out west that are part of the United States, but they're not states yet. Okay? Someday they're going to be states. And the Republican Party said if we stop the extension of slavery into all those territories out there, eventually those territories will become states that are free states. That is, they will vote for freedom, the end of slavery. And this is how we will end slavery someday. When enough of those states come into the Union and they're free states, they will vote for a constitutional amendment to end slavery in the United States. Now that's pretty simple, isn't it? It's gradual. It'll take a long time for that to happen. And that was actually thought to be a good because the Southerners would be able to see that it was going to happen and they'll have time to react, time to adjust, you see. Gradual. No extension of slavery into the territories of the Republican Party, 1850s. Republican candidate for president in 1860, Abraham Lincoln, argued that if slavery could not extend into the territories, that we could have someday control of Congress that would pass this constitutional amendment. Southerners, however, did not follow along as Lincoln and the Republicans hoped they would. They did not see the handwriting on the wall, and they said, "To hell with you! We're not giving up our slaves. We're not going to be taught what is moral by you Northerners. You don't know what it's like to live down here. You don't know what you're talking about." There you go. That's human nature. See? You can forget you're sitting on a hill. We have our own way of life. Don't care how gradual you make it. We're not giving up our slaves. Now in 1860, Abraham Lincoln is elected president of the United States. And the Republicans have control of Congress. They hope to pass legislation that will end slavery in the territories. Most Southerners then decided that they would not live in a union determined to end slavery at some point. And again, they don't care how gradual it is, how reasonable. So they decided to secede. Not succeed, secede. Okay? To leave the Union and set up their own new nation, the Confederate States of America. If they had been successful, and just in case you're confused by this, if they had been successful, there would have been two nations where there was one, and maybe even a third out west. Secession, then, was the trigger, pun intended, for the war. But what was the long-term cause of the war? Slavery. If there had been no slavery in the Union, there would have been no reason to secede. You see, it's not unreasonable that we can ask the two questions, is it? Yeah, not unreasonable at all. Now, in my previous class, I lay out a lot more detail as to this argument regarding slavery, but not the purpose of this lecture. That is an advertisement for that other class. And so now, the Southerners then gradually, over a period of months, secede from the Union. Each state comes out and they begin to form this Confederate States of America. Now, as far as war strategy was concerned, Lincoln, first off, decides not to let them go. You see, Lincoln could have just let them go. They could have had their country, and we would still be our 2 or 3 countries, and no war, right? And there were Northerners who said that's what Lincoln should do. Let them go. Wash our hands of the whole thing. How would that have helped the blacks in the South? Not at all. War was about slavery, folks. Always was. And it would have also had a dramatic impact on how the world saw democracy, because you see, the Southerners lost an election, okay? That's why they were mad. Lincoln got elected. They lost. Oh, now we're going to take our toys and go home. What happens to democracy if whenever the minority is unhappy enough to leave the political union, they do? Doesn't democracy depend? The whole idea of democracy depends upon the losers in an election agreeing to stay in the political union until the next election. If they don't, democracy doesn't work. You see? West Virginia, we have a state called West Virginia today. You know why we have West Virginia instead of just Virginia? There you go. If it's okay for you Southerners to secede from the Union, then we here in West Virginia, who like the Union, we're going to secede from Virginia. There you go. See? They never did get back together. You could have in a state that doesn't like, let's say you have a state in which there are 3 or 4 dominant cities and they vote one way, and the rest of 3/4 of the land mass of the state, the people that live in the rural areas, they don't like that. They want to secede. You could have that, couldn't you? Because we do have this rural-urban split. See? So democracy depends, and this is what Lincoln told the American people. We not only have to fight this war to end slavery, we have to fight it to save democracy. It's about the Union, too. 2 huge reasons to fight the war. Now the war goes on, and Lincoln hopes to put the Union back together while the war's being fought. So in order to do that, he's not going to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Because that would just make who more mad? Southerners. Lincoln wants to put the Union back together and then follow the gradual ending of slavery program. Until the middle of the war, when he realizes that's not going to work. No, that ain't going to work. Then he issues the Emancipation Proclamation because he realizes at that point, we got to totally defeat the South anyway. We might as well get the whole ball of wax, see? And not wait. That's when he issues the Emancipation Proclamation. That's when some historians, confused, begin to argue, now the war is about slavery. No. It was always about slavery. It was only a question of timing. Lincoln wins his victory. The slaves are freed. The Union is put back together. Democracy is saved. But freedom is not equality. That's why we have 2 words, folks. Freedom is not equality. And the former slaves, now free, were not equal with white males. They're just not slaves anymore. But neither were white females equal with white males. Indians are not equal with white males. Asians are not equal with white males. All we've done is end slavery. Big, huge. Oh, and save democracy. But the rest of American history from that time until your day is about the gradual coming of freedom, more freedom and equality to other groups, you see, besides white males. So this is where we pick up the story. The story will not be finished until Thomas Jefferson's words in the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal, are true for all men and women too. That's the story of American history. Questions? So normally the lecture won't be this long, but of course we had to do the syllabus today. I will see you on Thursday. Be sure you read Maclay chapter 12.